This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Kia ora, you are listening to Otago Access Radio 105.4 FM 1575 AM, and you are listening to Left From Nowhere, a show about politics and various things of interest to those politically inclined, hosted by the Otago Socialist Society, of which I happen to be a member, and my name is Tyler West. This is, of course, the first episode back since the New Year's break, so I hope all the listeners have had a good summer thus far. There is going to be a slight change in how the show is made up, as I will be becoming a lot busier this year, and as such will not have as much time to dedicate to the show, but I will still be around. It just means that our Pacific News segment at the start of the show has been cut, and will be compensated by a longer interview as such. So, today I will be interviewing Rinad Tamimi, who is a local Palestine activist of Palestinian descent, and we're going to be discussing the general situation not just in Palestine but involving Israel-Palestine at large, and what became last year a regional rather than simply a state conflict. So I'd like to jump right into it, and we'll have a hopefully nice long interview today where we can kind of stretch out and really explore the topics in some degree of depth. But I'd just like to open up with asking Rinad, how are you today?
I am good, thank you, and thank you for having me today. Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, no problem whatsoever. So I think a good place to start would be to just do, if you would like to do just a short introduction of yourself. Of course, being Palestinian-Kiwi yourself, you are very invested in the area, but maybe just a little bit about yourself before we get into the meat of the interview.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Name again, Rinad Tamimi. I was born and raised in Hebron in the West Bank of Palestine. Moved to New Zealand in 2008, so I've attended Otago Girls High School in Dunedin, and then went on to university and studied information science and marketing, and now I work at a contact centre, a call centre in Dunedin, and I am a mother and a wife, but also heavily involved in the Palestine movement here in Dunedin, and pretty much concerned about family back home 24/7.
Yeah, I can absolutely imagine that would be the case. So, yeah, one last thing before we get really into it is if you would like to talk just a little bit about the Palestinian organisations that exist in Dunedin, in case we have any listeners who don't know about the actual makeup of, kind of the local pro-Palestine political scene. Yeah,
definitely. We're, of course, very lucky to have many different people being in solidarity with us here in Dunedin. Without the support that we've had, particularly in the past 15 months, I don't think we would have been able to carry on this long, especially of how heavily involved we were in this movement itself and how emotionally invested we've been as well. We've got some members of PSNA in Dunedin, but other than that, we just call ourselves the Palestinian Coalition. So it's just members of the Palestinian community, plus just members of the lovely public people from different groups, different bits and pieces. And we've just had a rally last Saturday in Dunedin, which again brought out a huge number of amazing speakers, amazing people that were fully in support. But this year, inshallah, we will be focusing a bit more on the culture of Palestine and a bit more of marking specific solidarity days within the Palestinian calendar. And the way we usually talk or advertise these events would be through our Dunedin Palestine on Instagram and also Dunedin for Justice of Palestine on Facebook. We also do have a mailing list if people were interested to get our weekly or our monthly newsletters with updates.
Absolutely. So, yeah, any listeners, if this catches your interest and you have been wanting to get involved, keep those in mind, and I will remember at the end of the show, we'll just go over those ways to contact the local coalition again. So we'll move into the actual interview itself, and I've kind of structured it looking at different aspects of the conflict as it stands today. But given that, of course, Gaza has been the centre of the conflict for the entire 15 months that it has gone on, we'll start by just talking a little bit about the tentative and shaky ceasefire and prisoner exchange that's happening at the moment. Now, as I understand it, there has been a number of the Israelis held in Gaza have been released, as well as a number of Palestinians being held in various institutions across Israel.
Yeah.
Could you talk just a little bit to start off with about kind of the makeup of that and kind of what kind of numbers of people are we talking about when we're talking about this exchange?
Yeah, definitely. So if I remember well, this whole exchange is going to go in 3 different phases. So we are now still at phase 1. And from memory, I think at least now 20 plus Israelis would have been, or hostages have now been freed from Gaza from various different, as you mentioned, different areas within Gaza. So if we watch those exchange deals, we see that some have come out of Khan Yunis, some have come out of the central of Gaza, some have come out of by the beach area in Gaza, some of north of Gaza, which was heavily bombarded just before the ceasefire agreement as well, and almost got, fully taken by the Israeli army. But Palestinians-wise, we're talking about 100, then 100, then I think another 100, not 100% on numbers. I'm sure our lovely listeners will be able to look up exact numbers online. There's lots of footage. But I think the main thing that sticks out to me is how well and how much of a good health the Israeli hostages look like to be in compared to the Palestinian, I would also call them hostages. Palestinian hostages can barely walk. Some of them can barely talk. They've been, they've received a lot of torture. They've faced a lot of different torturing techniques, to say the least, within these prisons. So for them to be able to basically be free after being in prison for literally no reason all these years, it's been quite warming, but also, the ceasefire is just, you want to feel happy about it, but also you don't know what's happening next.
Yeah, of course, and there's been a lot of footage of large numbers of Palestinians returning to the north of the Strip, and there has been, a very... I'm not sure exactly how I would say it, because at this point I'm not surprised by any footage that comes out of Gaza, but it is still, heartrending footage to see people returning to areas that have been just completely demolished, not a single undamaged building as far as the eye can see, and returning nonetheless to those areas. Yeah. So what is, how are local people involved in Palestinian activism feeling about this ceasefire? Is there a general feeling that it's likely to hold, or are people feeling a lot more trepidation about that? Yeah,
I think it's just a mixture of feelings. So as much as we're happy for hostages to be freed, as much as we're happy for prisoners/hostages to be freed, it's with all this that's been happening, with the genocide that's been happening in the past 15 months, literally every day something happens. And as soon as you think, oh, yep, nothing can get worse than this, another hospital gets bombed or another journalist gets bombed or a whole family gets targeted or a whole big family gets wiped off the entire, records history. So we're all having very mixed feelings about it, mainly because now there is no ceasefire in the West Bank. For example, in Jenin, we've seen a huge, there's been bombings recently, displacement of more than 2,000 Palestinians, and even now more as we speak. The Israeli occupation is forcing more and more Palestinians to be leaving where they live in Jenin in particular, but also some parts of Tulkarem, which is also in the West Bank, some parts of Nablus, even in my hometown in Hebron. The other day, a groom got taken out of his wedding simply because the Israeli army felt like they needed to do that. And also Palestinians have been ordered by the Israeli occupation forces to not be able. They're not allowed to celebrate the prisoners coming out. So if they celebrate, they might be taken into prison. And sadly, we've seen a lot of prisoners coming out, but then a lot of them went back in. A lot of new ones went back in. So the local community is... We had a gathering / like a celebration or / marking this milestone that we got to together in the Octagon a couple of weeks ago, which was really nice to be together and dance dabka and show our lovely solidarity movement and people like the other side of Palestine, which is how rich our culture is and how rich and, how much there is to our culture more than just the genocide and war.
Yeah, absolutely. The way that I've felt about this intensification of the occupation in the West Bank is that how it sort of appears to me is that you have the ceasefire, which again is very shaky and could fall apart in Gaza, and this intensification in the West Bank. But because the intensification in the West Bank is not to the level of the destruction seen in Gaza, it kind of just flows a little bit under the radar. So you can have an intensification of bombing and of raids and of people being captured and small-scale skirmishes, people being killed, of course, without it becoming as big of an international news story as Gaza has been over the last year and a bit.
Definitely.
And one thing that I think is useful to clarify for listeners who may not necessarily know a lot about the politics of Palestine, in Palestine itself, not necessarily of the diaspora and the solidarity movement, but in Palestine itself, is kind of clarifying that Hamas it's far from the only political actor in Palestine, and there's a big difference between where particular Palestinian parties or political organizations have their base of strength. There are some that exist mostly or entirely in the West Bank, some that exist mostly entirely in Gaza. And I would like to, if you would mind, just talk a little bit about some of the actual differences between the different Palestinian organizations that operate in Palestine and also in Israel itself.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got Hamas, which is mainly in Gaza. So a few years ago, there was an agreement that Hamas would just be in Gaza. And then the other group that we have is the Palestinian Authority group, which in Arabic we call Fatah. So we've got Fatah, we've got Hamas. Fatah is more on the in the West Bank side of Palestine, and they operate in the West Bank. And their head leader is Mahmoud Abbas, where you've got Hamas in Gaza and mostly in Gaza. And that's why I think when the whole genocide started and then Israel was bombing Gaza, but at the same time they were making up excuses to bomb the West Bank, and everyone was saying, well, there's no Hamas in the West Bank. And so it just shows you how much they're just willing to ethnic cleanse and just, just kill as much as they can, and there's no legitimate reason to do so. Those are the two different Palestinian groups that are in Palestine. And I'm sure people have had or seen mixed news of, the Palestinian Authority, for example, ordering the Al Jazeera to stop reporting in the West Bank and only report in Gaza. So for Palestinians, that's a big deal because it's like, well, why are you stopping people from reporting in Jenin, for example? So there's, unfortunately, there is a bit of inner situation going on, and hopefully that won't, expand to something bigger than it is, because we should all be focusing on, the end of occupation, not fighting our brothers and sisters.
Absolutely. And these are the two essentially governing bodies in Gaza and the West Bank, respectively. Yeah. And of course, there are a variety of organizations, some of which have been around for a long time, like the PFLP, some of which are quite new. I understand there's some small kind of, I guess you call them resistance cells in the West Bank, a group called the Lion's Den, which I read about recently.
Yeah, there's a lot of different little ones as well. And
but I think the point I'm trying to get to is that people who kind of treat Palestine as this one homogenous mass, just like any national body or national group, you can't just kind of reduce it to a single homogenous, monolithic, okay, well, there's one party and everyone supports that one party. It's
no.
Much like any other society, there is a wide array of how people want to respond to the ongoing occupation and now the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, as well as occupation of Palestine generally and ethnic cleansing of Gaza. It's not just everyone supports this one group, which I think is a message that's always worth getting across, because I think personally one of the ways that Palestinians get dehumanized is by acting as though it's just one undifferentiated mass.
Yeah, no, definitely. A lot of people do make these misconceptions, and they just think, as you said, Palestinians just support one group or support the other group. I don't think, they realize how much. Of course, the media has a lot to do with this, but, there are also ordinary people in Palestine that don't support either of these groups or any of those groups. They just simply want to raise their children and live a happy life without any political affiliations or anything like that. But I think recently, though, from what we've seen in Gaza, we can see a lot that the bigger group is leaning towards supporting the resistance, because they see that as the only way of basically exiting this war, or they see them as their heroes out of this war. Despite everything and all the killing and the destruction and everything that Gaza has gone through, you see people looking up to them, basically.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where if you're put in an impossible situation, then a flawed response is a response nonetheless.
Yeah.
So I think we've touched on it already. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, before we move on to the neighbouring countries and how they've been affected by this conflict, talk a little bit about the loosely floated plan from the new Trump administration in the US to essentially ethnically cleanse all of Gaza. Now, obviously, this would be an immense crime. It would be a crime against humanity. There is a reason why ethnic cleansing is a byword for some of the worst crimes imaginable. The term originating during the Yugoslav wars was applied to some of the worst crimes committed in Europe since the Second World War. So it's not exactly a neutral term. It's we're talking about something that would be absolutely terrible were it to happen. Is there a lot of worry among the Palestinian community and among people that support it that this could be more than just bluffing or spitballing, as Trump often does with policy? Yeah,
no, definitely. I think ever since Trump, basically helped with the ceasefire agreement take place, we all, as Palestinians in particular, had bad feelings about it, because it's definitely too good to be true. Like, why is he supporting this? And now, obviously, as we would have seen a few days ago, it was, we want the whole thing wiped out. We want all those people wiped out and out of Gaza. And even within the Israeli government itself, they've been releasing some orders or some news saying that there might be a way of getting Palestinians out of Gaza soon if they wanted to, but it will be a one-way out. Which has been really, it's been received with heavy hearts recently to some Palestinians that read the news, because that means Palestinians who are now, or Gazans who are now in New Zealand, for example, they can't go back to Gaza. Or now Gazans that are in Gaza that have to travel for medical reasons or anything like that, they can't return. And we know Palestinians will always choose to live on their land or to die on their land rather than leaving and not being able to come back. But it's just, again, ethnic cleansing, and I don't think it's just bluffing, but I also hope it is, just because I don't think the scale of all of this, I don't think our hearts can bear anymore or take any more destruction or another war, basically.
Absolutely. And the other question, which I guess has kind of been raised now, is what comes after. At some point, at least, the most active phase of the fighting will decline. I don't think it's going to completely vanish. I think and I imagine you would as well, just how Israel and Palestine are set up is just a unwinnable situation.
Yeah.
It's going to break one way or another.
Definitely.
But the scale of what would be required to make Gaza livable for that amount of population again must be absolutely unimaginable at the moment.
Yep, definitely. I think it's, seeing people going from, I think, over 300,000 Palestinians fleeing back to the north, and just trying to even understand one or two of the stories that people, out of millions of stories that people are sharing. For example, I saw a video of a man holding a child that wasn't even his own child, and he was taking him back to North Gaza to be able to hopefully maybe find his parents. I think they did manage to get his parents, but you think of all these different scenarios, all these different situations, how much grief people have now finally maybe gotten themselves 5 minutes to sit down and think about or start to grieve. And I think, to get rid of the rubble itself is just going to take, at least it was estimated, take at least 14 years or something just to get rid of all the destruction, let alone just, start rebuilding again. I think as much as we can help rebuild, as much as we can help having Gaza be the same again, it's never going to look the same again. And some memories will never come back to people, and it's the people that they live the memories with that they will no longer be able to have back, unfortunately. But at least for the ceasefire to take effect and to hold, that would give people some hope.
Yeah, even at the earliest stage, we're talking about like November, December 2023, when it was still very fresh. I was seeing a lot of comparisons to Grozny, which was famously in the early 2000s very heavily bombed during the Russian war in Chechnya.
Yeah.
And Grozny at the time was called the single most destroyed city on earth.
Yeah.
So the comparisons even 12 months ago or more were to something that became a byword for unimaginable levels of urban destruction.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing is when it comes to this plan that's been floated to move the entire population of Gaza, is that where do they go? Because in the last few days, the response from the administrations of various neighbouring Arab countries is no, absolutely not. You won't be doing that. We won't take them.
Yeah.
And I don't think that, even though cynically speaking, there will be a certain degree of, well, we don't have the infrastructure to take these people. We don't want to make the additional expenditure of keeping these people alive. I believe there is also a very high degree of we don't want to be pushed around and have our policy decided for us.
Yeah.
And also a recognition that even though a lot of these are flawed, or even some might say criminal governments in terms of what they've done in the past, that there is an earnestness with which they are saying that we will not allow this to happen.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think it, I mean, to be honest, as an Arab, I would say this, that we have seen no support from the Arab countries or the Arab leaders. Okay, they've tried to send aid in. Okay, they've tried to, settle this war down, but we haven't seen actual support to stop this war. And I think if you think about each country, they're each keeping to their own connections and wanting their own connections to be safe and their own countries to be safe. But I think the other part to it is that they also believe, just as us Palestinians believe, that Palestinians belong to the land. They want to stay in the land. So it's not a matter of this country will take them or that country will take them or welcome them. It's also that it's their country. So why should they leave their homeland to start off with? But I know I've seen that news that you probably have seen, and Egypt saying something, and then you've got Lebanon having its own dramas, and but I mean the nearest or the border is by Egypt, so that would be the next country you're looking at getting Gazans to go to. But also I do know from personal experiences and from what I've been hearing from other families, Palestinians aren't getting treated any good in Egypt either, because unfortunately, when war happens, rent prices go up. When they know you're a Palestinian, they can't offer you work. Everything suddenly goes up in price, and just all these different scenarios. So it's, yeah, exactly. It's like, well, where do you want Palestinians to go to then?
Yeah, and before we move on to Lebanon, which I would really like to talk about, I guess one more note on the question of Palestinian refugees, and of course there already is an enormous Palestinian refugee community living in neighbouring countries. Jordan, I believe, a fifth of the population is either
largely there. Yes.
Is either first generation Palestinian refugees or the descendants of Palestinian refugees. I think something that has frustrated me for close to a decade now, basically since the big refugee crisis in 2015, around 2015, is this notion that the Arab countries have not taken anyone in.
Yep.
Now, that's not to say that, I say Arab countries, but I'm also including Turkey in this, so
Yep.
Middle Eastern countries are not taking anyone in. And this, I've always found this immensely frustrating because it's just not true. That's not to say that the Palestinian communities have been treated necessarily well in these countries, but a lot of these countries have taken hundreds of thousands. In the case of Turkey, I believe upwards of 2 million people.
Yeah.
Now, not all of those are Palestinians, but there are long-standing Palestinian refugee communities in all of those countries, and many of those communities number in the tens or hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think as Palestinians, we've just been refugees everywhere. Everywhere you go, you would find Palestinians, and I would never have thought that coming to New Zealand all the way from Palestine, I would find Palestinians in New Zealand. So it shows you how much we are shattered everywhere. But also, yeah, you're right. Jordan has a huge number of Palestinian refugees. So does Turkey. So does Iraq. Literally everywhere you could think of. But yeah, as you said, they're not treated the nicest way either. So it also makes it difficult.
Yeah, and one more thing before we move on is, and this is just a note from me, but a lot of these countries do not have the degree of state capacity that a lot of Western countries have, even though a lot of Western countries have experienced a decline in state capacity, especially over the last kind of decade or two, but particularly since about the 1980s. A lot of countries, we're talking about countries that are already war-torn, that are taking in refugees nonetheless, even whilst a lot of them have recently hemorrhaged refugees to other parts of the world. I mean, talking about a large population of Palestinian refugees living in Iraq. It's not that long ago that Iraq was a battle zone either in the war against ISIS, and before that there was, of course, the invasion and occupation, which caused an immense amount of chaos in Iraq and in neighbouring areas. So a lot of these countries that are being asked to take in even more refugees are both not being acknowledged for being the home to large refugee populations as it stands, and also there's not really any offer to genuinely support these countries in having the infrastructure to take in such a large and rapid influx of people.
Yep, it's definitely not just about taking refugees in, it's just about, can you actually afford, can your country have the infrastructure to have those people? So,
So I'd like to move on to Lebanon. Of course, southern Lebanon was invaded by Israeli forces last year. It was something that a lot of people thought might be the beginning of a generalized regional war. Thankfully, that didn't quite happen. But it did result in thousands of Lebanese being killed, the massive degradation of Hezbollah's state capacity in southern Lebanon, where they have their, had at least, their most significant kind of political and state infrastructure. And I think it's worth noting that Lebanon as it stands has been a significant crisis for a number of years. So it's an invasion of a country that at several points in the last decade or so has been viewed as teetering on the edge of state collapse. There was, of course, a very major economic crisis in the late 2010s, which impoverished a great many Lebanese people. Lebanon is already recovering from the Lebanese-Israeli war in the mid-2000s, but also the aftermath of the Civil War. And people are very quick to forget just how much of Beirut was badly damaged by the famous Beirut port explosion, which was only about 3 years ago, I believe, something along those lines. So when it comes to this invasion of southern Lebanon, I think a lot of New Zealanders don't quite understand why that happened. Do you think you talk a little bit about where that fits in with the wider story of this ethnic cleansing of Gaza?
Yeah, definitely. I think it shows how much, I think there's a famous map that's on social media, and it shows you the, on the Israeli soldiers' uniform, how they've got Palestine, they've got Lebanon, I believe they've got Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And it just shows you how much, again, Israel's just making up excuses to just bomb and also take over or ethnic cleanse other countries in the region. We thought it would stop when, they bombed or killed Hezbollah. And it clearly hasn't. And they've been ethnic cleansing more and more Lebanese people. And as you said, you've described it perfectly well. Lebanon was literally starting to stand on its feet after all these different situations that they've gone through in that country. So it's not like they went to a rich country and they decided to bomb it. They went to the weakest country that you could, or not the weakest, but one of the weakest countries you could think of in the area. So it's, I think it just shows you how much Israel is willing to take control over the Middle East, and that it's not just Gazans that they are after. They might have a bigger plan of, and I think there was a famous video of Netanyahu that aired before it got aired after the genocide started, but it was showing a map of how he wanted the Middle East to look like and how much he would love to obviously take over that side of the world. So,
there's also like a very complex within the most conservative, the most nationalist wings of kind of Israeli political thought. There were a lot of different types of justification for expansion, but also a lot of different justifications for isolation and should we expand in this direction or that direction, and what exactly is the basis that we're arguing for, because you have more secular nationalists who probably will cynically use kind of religious doctrine but probably don't really believe it that much in order to justify expansion. But you also have You also have more directly religious or even fundamentalist arguments for expansion as well.
Yeah.
So there's a complex political scene in there too, even if that scene is by and large on the same page when it comes to the status of Palestinians. The other place where actual ground operations have taken place is just outside of the Golan Heights, which is already recognized as a area of occupation, occupied from Syria a number of decades ago. And recently, with the fall of the Assad regime and the assumption of power by what is now no longer known as the HTS, Tahrir al-Sham, if I remember right. I might be getting that wrong.
Maybe. Yeah.
At any rate, the newly established government, at any rate, Israel has moved troops further into Syrian territory. So would you be able to talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, I think I've got something written down about that. And my husband's from Syria, so we've been heavily, you watch the news all the time and they know what's going on in Syria and they've got people affected. But basically, I read this today and it was basically saying, will Israel ever end its occupation of the Syrian land? And here's how it appears to be making its presence permanent. So it said that I call it the Golan Heights because that's how we say it in Arabic. Israel occupied it in 1967. Then in December 2024, it took control of even more of the Syrian land that you just mentioned. Israel said its military presence in Syria after the collapse of the Assad regime would be temporary, but now it's building 2 military bases on Syrian land near the Golan Heights. Satellite imagery examined by the Washington Post showed multiple structures and vehicles in an Israeli base. Experts say that the areas of cleared land appear to be the start of new bases as they have roads that link to the occupied Golan Heights. And I think from what a lot of the Syrian community people have said after the Assad regime falling, they said, how come? Why was this just, again, too good to be true? And they, I think, deep down, as much as Syrians were happy to be, free after all these years, they were also concerned. It's like the ceasefire agreement. They want to be happy about it, but at the same time, well, what's happening next? Or who actually supported Assad to, escape, and who is now going to, I'm sure there is a lot going on in the background that we haven't seen yet, that I wouldn't be surprised that, there could have been some support from Israel to support the the new regime now to get rid of Assad's regime, to maybe get more land in Syria.
Which, of course, if that is the case, we won't know probably for a long time, and it may not be the case. However, it is certainly, I would say, very opportunistic on the part of the Israeli government, and a very kind of, they can use security to say that, but they've used security to justify basically everything else they've done. So it's a very hollow justification at this point. We're getting towards the latter end of the show. Just a reminder to the listeners that you are listening via Otago Access Radio, 105.4 FM, 1575 AM, and that the show you're listening to, Left From Nowhere, is sponsored by the Otago Socialist Society. Bringing us to kind of the latter stage, before we get into the reviews, which I end every show with, just a... I guess what is the local kind of Palestinian solidarity movement? What is it feeling looking into the future? How are they feeling about the year coming?
I think as much as the genocide was probably the worst we've seen in recent times, it's definitely brought out really good things as well. A lot of people are now aware of what's happening in Palestine. A lot of people are now aware of the culture, of the language, of the food. And I think It's really hard. It's really hard to even know. Like we've had a meeting the other day to look at what we wanted to achieve this year. And it's like, do we look at, of course, we want to end the occupation. We want to lift the siege. We want the government to issue our Palestinian families humanitarian visas. But at the same time, with the scale of what's happening in the West Bank and then Gaza, and then you hear this and you hear that, it's really hard to know what we're looking to achieve this year. But we have decided that, if snap actions come across, we decide on snap actions. We let our lovely solidarity people know. But at the same time, we're hoping, as I said at the start of the show, just to mark more solidarity days with Palestine this year. We're hoping to do something for Land Day, for Nakba Day, Palestine Child's Day. There's Prisoners' Day as well. There is also a few events happening at the university, which were organised by the Otago Staff for Palestine. So the film documentary Israelism will be screened, I believe, on the 5th of March. But again, our listeners can follow us on Dunedin Palestine on Instagram and Dunedin for Justice in Palestine on Facebook to be updated more with our events. But we are just hoping for more and more peace and just less war, I guess. That's as simple as we want to put it.
Of course. And if you would like to run through the ways that people could contact or keep in touch with what's happening as well.
Definitely. I think there's a few, other than Al Jazeera, there's Al Jazeera English, there's Al Jazeera, the main Al Jazeera, there is AJ Plus. You can find those on Instagram or Facebook or simply YouTube. You can also listen to my radio show, The Watermelon Report, also aired on ORFM every Thursday, 8:30 p.m. And it's also on Apple Podcast and Spotify, where I give weekly updates of what's happening in Palestine. And again, so Dunedin Palestine Instagram, Dunedin for Justice in Palestine on Facebook. There is the PSNA group as well, all over New Zealand. Those are the ones I can think of now. But I think with the genocide happening, you can see how powerful social media can be, and a lot of Gazans have used that to their advantage, as they should have. So, played a huge part.
Yeah, and is there, like an email that people can get in touch with to be added to the mailing list for local events?
There would be, but not on me right now. So I think if they just send us a message on the Dunedin group or the Instagram page, we can definitely get them added to that mailing list.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we'll move on to the reviews section before I sign out for this episode. Rinad, did you bring anything with you that you'd like to discuss?
I didn't, but I've got two recommendations of books that I've just started reading, but I haven't really started reading. So there's the 100 Years of War on Palestine, I believe it's called, and also Mornings in Jenin. So two powerful books that people can get. I believe you can just easily buy them from Preserved Identity, which is a local charity in Auckland that sells things for Palestine, basically. Or you could find copies online as well. But those are the two books I would like to recommend. That's all I can think of for now. Yeah,
so we'll close up with the reviews that I always give. Of course, I, as I always do, review one piece of New Zealand media and one piece of general media. That's a bit of a free slot to plug whatever I've been into recently. To start with the New Zealand media, I will be recommending To Build a Nation, Bruce Jesson's Collected Writings, 1975 to 1999, an edited collection of the works of journalist and local Auckland political figure Bruce Jesson. That was published in 2005 by Penguin. Bruce Jesson was a really interesting figure on the New Zealand left in the 1970s through 90s. While I don't agree with a lot of his political positions in a kind of in in the specifics, I guess. I do think that he was one of the most insightful and interesting writers and thinkers that the New Zealand left produced in that period of the late 20th century and kind of the aftermath of the later stages and aftermath of the new left in New Zealand. His works cover a wide variety of areas in New Zealand politics, although his main interests were always the cause of republicanism in New Zealand, the end of monarchy, and the establishment of a truly democratic state. And also in the economics of New Zealand and how to build a society for all people. His works also look a lot at issues ranging from the day-to-day of the New Zealand politics through to issues of race and even religion in New Zealand, and also at some of the personalities and structures that existed kind of behind the veil of New Zealand politics as well. He wrote quite a bit about, for example, the career of Winston Peters prior to and after the formation of New Zealand First, as well as a bunch of other figures as well, and some of his writings on the Labour Party in the 1970s and early 1980s are very much presaging the direction that Labour would take in the late 1980s with its switch to free market reforms. At any rate, it's a very interesting collection of his works between the 70s and 90s, and I really highly recommend it regardless of whether you wind up agreeing with what he writes. I think kind of engaging with that more intellectual side of New Zealand's political life is a valuable thing that people don't always do. Now, for a more light-hearted one, I'll also be recommending the album Woodland Rights by Green Lung from 2019. I absolutely adore this album. I discovered it last year, having been aware of Green Lung but never really giving them the chance for some time. Woodland Rights is a relatively witchy and almost occultish look at British life, I guess, in the earlier decades. It's very much focused on the idea of old ways and old religions surviving into the modern day, and I think it has a distinct... I'm actually sure, I think they may even be an American band, but it has a distinctly British feel to it, regardless. Drawing on the revival of the new religious movement wave and the revival of folk religion in Britain in the 1960s and 70s, and especially the kind of conservative society consternation that caused. On top of the really interesting themes underpinning the album, Woodland Rights is also a fantastic slab of stoner metal, a genre that I feel quite strongly for because I absolutely love the sound of it. I love the witchy vibes of stoner metal. I love the fuzz of it, the kind of neo-70s feeling that a lot of those albums give. A lot of albums in that genre, should I say, give. And generally speaking, I think it's one of my favourite recent finds in terms of an album. At any rate, highly recommend both the book and the album. Once again, that's To Build a Nation, Bruce Jesson Collected Writings, 1975 to 1999, from 2005, published by Penguin, and Green Lung's Woodland Rights, which was released in 2019. Rinad, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciated the discussion. If you wanted to maybe recommend those two, reiterate what those two books were that you recommended.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you again for having me. And I'm sure there's so much more to discuss in the future. Mornings in Dunedin. I don't have the author's name, but it will easily be Googled. And also 100 Years of War on Palestine, I believe it's called, but they'll easily be found on Google, but also Preserved Identity in Auckland. They've got their own website, and they've got a lot of different books as well that you can read on Palestine in particular.
Okay, fantastic. Just a reminder to the listeners that this is a show sponsored by the Otago Socialist Society, and usually we leave the kind of end slot of the program for upcoming events. We don't have any public events coming up in the next month. However, keep an eye on our social media accounts on Facebook and Instagram. Both of those are just Otago Socialist Society. For we will, at least next month, be doing one of our social drinks, and we will be announcing any upcoming events through those mediums. If you want to get onto the mailing list, Otago Socialist Society at gmail.com is how to do so, and you will be updated on what our upcoming events are, as well as events such as local Palestinian solidarity events that we believe are worth engaging with and supporting here in Dunedin, as well as occasionally across Otago. I think we're going to leave it there. Once again, you were listening to Otago Access Radio 105.4 FM 1575 AM. I am your host, Tyler West, signing out, and you will hear from me once again in 4 weeks' time on this show, Left From Nowhere.
The weight sucks stronger by the year. The weight sucks stronger by the year. The weight sucks stronger by the year. The answer's never clear. You walk upon the sphere. Keep walking.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.